Welcome to the fourth edition of the Sephardi Modernity Seminar Series. The title of this year's series is Carving Out Light, Sephardi Mizrahi Women's Paradigm Change, and it is organized by Yuval Ivry and myself, Angie Cohen. In our last meeting, Sigal Nagar-Ron and Neta Amar Shif shared with us the contribution of Mizrahi feminism towards peace and justice and a different political paradigm in the Israel and Palestine region. Sigal Nagar-Ron shared her work on the tight connection between ethnicity and inequality mechanisms, which includes both Mizrahim and Palestinians. She explained how the Mizrahi feminist standpoint does not think of women as a unified category, but rather recognizes the diversity of their vulnerabilities and therefore the different systems of oppression they may be subjected to. She referred to the Southeast perspective as taking the experiences of populations such as Mizrahi women and turning them into sources of knowledge, recognizing their insights into the society they live in, and demanding a more fair distribution of resources, both material and symbolic. The recognition of the role ethnicity plays in cultural and economic injustices led to her work on the Central Bureau of Statistics, which influenced the decision of a new policy. The Central Bureau of Statistics will, after 2022, publish data on ethnic-based inequality. Finally, Sigal Nagar-Ron spoke about her work on students who are first in their family to acquire an academic education and stated that in order to produce non-hegemonic knowledge, universities must include faculty members who come from the margins of society as well. Neta Amar Shif spoke about three moments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since the Oslo Accords: the identity moment of Oslo, the constitutional moment of the nation-state law, and later the judicial reform, and the existential moment marked by the October 7th massacre. Events like the nation-state law, against which Amar Shif litigated, would have marked a constitutional moment through which Palestinians were excluded as a national minority, while the Arabness of many Mizrahi Jews was negated, while undermining the status of Arabic as a Jewish language, and more specifically, the language of Mizrahim. She spoke about the Mizrahian feminist approach as having the potential to re-articulate identity in a shared land, and presented the Mizrahi voice as an internal critique that had the uncomfortable function of reminding Israel of its internal inequality. The liberatory potential of the Mizrahi standpoint would reside in its ability to force the Jewish society to look inside and see what is hindering peace and justice. She finally presented the concept of mutual rescue of Palestinians and Israelis as a paradigm that would substitute the present one, which is mutual destruction. The recognition that both peoples have a mutually conditioned coexistence is at the bottom of this idea of the mutual rescue. She reminded us that the civilian voice only has values, and that civilians don't hold the guns. They don't make military decisions. This voice, then the civilian voice from the Mizrahi Civic Collective, calls for the mutual rescue, even if it might be on Israelis to start. Today, we are welcoming Susan Starcered and Heftsi Cohen-Montagu, who will look at Mizrahi women's paradigm as well, although from a different perspective, that of the ethics of tradition.
Thank you, Angie. And I will present the speakers, and then we're going to start the conversation. So Susan Starcered is a professor of sociology at Suffolk University at Boston, Massachusetts. She's the author of more than a dozen of books, including Women as Ritual Experts, The Religious Lives of Elderly Jewish Women in Jerusalem, What Makes Women Sick, Maternity, Modesty, and Militarization in Israeli Society, and Can't Catch a Break, Gender Jail, Drugs, and the Limits of Personal Responsibility. Her research has taken her from an immigrant neighborhood in Jerusalem to a fishing village in Okinawa, Japan, and to the homeless shelters of Boston, Massachusetts. A mother of 4 adult children and grandmother to a growing pack of grandchildren, she currently lives in Newton, Massachusetts, with her husband. I'm also live in Newton, so we're probably neighbors. Heftsi Cohen-Montagu is a co-founder of Bet Midrash Arevot and the leader of Degel Yehuda, egalitarian Sephardi community in Jerusalem. I was a member of this wonderful community 15 years ago that Heftsi is leading for many, many years. And she also a freelance editor and translator. She has a BA in archaeology and Jewish history and an MA in comparative religion from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, with a focus on women and religion. She has been active in the field of Jewish Renaissance in Israel for many, many years. As a developer of programs in pluralistic Jewish education and Bet Midrash facilitator. She was also a fellow in the Bezalel Narkis Center for Jewish Studies, for Jewish Art at the Hebrew University, and acted as a researcher and curator of exhibitions on religion, women, and culture. Heftsi is married and mother of 3. So I'm looking forward for this conversation, but before we start, we kindly remind you, the audience, that the seminar will be structured as usual, 50 minutes of conversation, and then hopefully we're going to have half an hour or so, maybe a bit more, for questions and answers. Roy Shukon, that is with us, our friend and colleague, will moderate the chat. So you are welcome to write your questions in there, and he can read it up. Or if some of you, and we really encourage you to do so, wishes to open their microphone and to have their own question, you are very welcome, but just make sure that you let us know on the chat and wait for your turn. So with not further ado, Angie, to you, and let's start the conversation. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuval. And so we are going to structure it as follows. I'm going to start by asking some questions to Susan, and then we're going to move on to Heftsi. So Susan, first of all, thank you for being here and for agreeing to this format. And my first question for you is, one of your earliest research projects was an ethnography of a day center in the Kurdish neighborhood of Jerusalem, where you studied the religious life of Mizrahi women. This work would later have great influence on a whole generation of women, me included, who learned to look at these practices from the perspective of a nuanced religious world, a worldview centered on ethics, and specifically on ethics of caring. Can you say a bit about what you see decades later as the most important aspects of this work?
First of all, thank you so much, Angie, and the rest of the team. Yuval, we'll figure out where we live, probably next door to each other. It's really a delight to be here. And this invitation really challenged me to reflect on research that I did many, 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 many years ago at a really different stage of life. I mean, to sort of put it in context, I was pregnant with my second child, and I had a toddler, less than an infant, at the time I did this research in Jerusalem. So this has been a challenge. And so I'm going to try to pull some thoughts together. And so I think the first thing that I do want to say is it made me so happy to hear Heftzi's introduction, because it was just out there, Heftsi, that you studied religious studies with an emphasis on women at Hebrew University. When I started at the Hebrew University, so we're looking at about 1980, something like that, I distinctly remember going to the Department of Religious Studies. It was only a graduate program in those days, and telling Professor Michael Stone, super nice guy, I'm sure many of you have met him over the years, that I want to focus on women in religion. And he said, that's great. Let's keep that a secret agenda. And he signed me up for Greek and Talmud classes. And I was clearly not going to learn a lot about how women experience the world through texts written by men thousands of years ago. But
In Greek.
yeah, but you pay your dues and you do what you do. And I think at some point it stopped being so much of a secret agenda. So what I was interested in as I began that research was looking for instances in which women have some religious autonomy. You know, when I look back at the books that I read when I was an undergraduate and studied history of religions, I see that in all the margins I've scribbled, well, what were the women doing? What were the women saying? What were the women thinking? And there was plenty of stuff about images of women and feminine symbols. And there was a lot of stuff about the status of women in religious law, but there was almost nothing about women's actual religious practices as they understand them themselves. So for my master's work at Hebrew University, I had looked at women's religious activity at Rachel's tomb. And this was way before the place became totally militarized, and there's now pretty much a fort around it. And the Milk Grotto of the Virgin Mary, which is also a fertility shrine down the street from Rachel's tomb. So I was easing my way into this kind of ethnographic work. For both of those shrines, I looked at the historical records and the pilgrimage reports, but I did some field work. When I had more courage and started to think about my dissertation, I looked about for a setting in which women had as much religious autonomy as I could identify. And I was limited to doing research in Israel. You know, they said I was pregnant at the time. And after a lot of just asking around and networking and reading, I came to understand that in Kurdistan, in the Jewish community, men and women had very separate lives. And from what I read, they even spoke slightly different dialects of Neo-Aramaic. They had different musical traditions, different dancing traditions. There was no women's section in the synagogue. The women would gather at the house of a woman, and they had their own rituals and their own prayers and their own songs. So I thought this would be a great community to study and to try to understand. And fortunately, there is a really, or there was at the time, a very tight and strong Kurdish community in Jerusalem and in the Nachlaot neighborhood. And I was fortunate and landed at this day center that was mostly Kurdish women, elderly Kurdish women. And I was trying to understand, I wasn't a folklorist. You know, I wasn't trying to see, you know, oh, these women are so cute and, you know, what have they preserved of the old ways? But I was really trying to understand how they saw the world. So I wasn't coming in as a folklorist or as a psychologist. I was trying to understand women as legitimate religious and moral actors. And, you know, I think that there were many important things I learned in that research. Certainly one of the most important things is the topic of today's panel, which is the centrality of caring for other people. And just remember that back in those days, being nice or caring was seen as a lower level of moral development than more like ideological or theoretical or generalizable moral principles. And so for me, this research opened my eyes to a totally different way of understanding the world. The women told me many stories. Some of them were their own variations of stories that are in the Midrash. Some of them were folk stories. Some of them were personal experiences of their own in which a really educated or wealthy or high status or important man tried to save someone or solve a problem, and he didn't succeed. And who succeeded? The poorest, most uneducated woman was the one who was able to solve the problem. So certainly from their perspective, there was no more moral virtue to literacy or to institutionalized authority than there was to really caring for other people, taking care of other people, being very, very invested in other people, and understanding what we now just take for granted in our worldview today, which is that human beings are connected in nets of relationships. And what happens to one person impacts and ripples everybody in the world. And I think they understood that in a profound way. And their religious life reflected that. So I'm going to close this this particular question with something that really stood out to me, which was how many candles the women would light. You know, I mean, I grew up, you know, people lit either 2 Shabbat candles or maybe you lit a candle for each family member. A lot of the women that I was meeting were lighting just like dozens of candles. I still remember one man telling me that his mother spent her entire Bituach Leumi check on candles. And those candles were aimed at drawing divine attention to particular real human beings. And the number of those candles was the clearest indicator that their ethics of caring was not limited to their immediate family. It was much wider than that. So that's a great question. Thank you, Angie.
Fascinating. Thank you. So 3 decades later, in what ways has the work with these Kurdish women informed your later studies on women's religion, as well as other research you have conducted?
I think it's informed everything I've done since then. I think it's shaped me as a person in this world. And it has certainly shaped all of my research. So beginning with the kind of more obvious answer, the work was so fascinating, it left me frustrated because I wanted to understand what women do when they have religious autonomy. And these women certainly had more religious autonomy than almost any other group of Jewish women I could think of, precisely because they were non-literate. So they could describe as being katuv b'Torah anything that they thought was important. So there was autonomy. But the reality is that they were moral and ritual experts within the context of a very patriarchal society. They did not have full autonomy over their lives, over their bodies, even over their thinking. You know, they did go to the synagogue where there was the rabbi, and they went to the day center where a rabbi would give a shiur once a week. And they were deeply exposed to male-dominated, quote, normative Judaism. You know, their kids went to Israeli schools. Some went to Mamlechti Dati schools, some to Mamlechti schools. But in either case, they were learning this kind of normative, definitely Ashkenazi oriented, but definitely textually oriented Judaism. So a few years down the line, my youngest was 3, and I felt ready to travel. In the meantime, I had, you know, done some research on cultural settings where women dominate a religious group of some sort, whether it's a sect or whether it's an offshoot or whether it's a tribe, but where women do have kind of more autonomy around their religious lives. And in the context of doing that research, there was one society that really stood out to me, and that was Okinawa. So Okinawa is a set of islands south of Japan where traditionally women have been the mainstream legitimate religious leaders. There's no word for priest. It's women who are the religious leaders, and it's official, it's acknowledged, it's described in, you know, texts by Chinese and Japanese and Portuguese sailors and travelers who came to these islands. And so I wanted to, you know, take what I'd learned from the Kurdish women and go a step further and see what the world looks like when having to navigate within a patriarchal framework isn't even really part of the equation. So certainly the work with the Kurdish women, you know, left me eager for more and wanting more. But I think there were a couple of themes in the work with the Kurdish women that carried over in really, really strong ways into my work in Okinawa and then other research I've done since then. The first one is the centrality of illness and health and healing in the moral and ritual world of the Kurdish women. You know, Tibria is not just sort of said as, you know, have a good day. It really is taken very seriously. And illness is understood very holistically. Health is understood holistically. And the women that I came to know saw themselves as having vital roles in repairing and ensuring the health of their communities. So I think I was very tuned into this religion health relationship because of the work with the Kurdish women. And what for me put, the seal on the bargain of wanting to go to Okinawa is that Okinawa is it is the only place in the world where women are the official leaders of the mainstream religion. It's not a sect, it's not a cult. Okinawa is also the healthiest society in the world. And we know that life expectancy, and even more importantly, healthy years of life expectancy, are heavily correlated to economic well-being and what's called stable family structures. Well, Okinawa is the poorest prefecture in Japan with an incredibly high divorce rate, and it is still the healthiest prefecture in Japan. So something was going on there that was creating a healthy environment for people that had nothing to do with the standard measures of what is healthy. And I think what I came to understand in my time in Okinawa is that the women, and particularly the women who are more religiously involved, who are loosely translated as priestesses, it really should be translated as deities, there was no distinction for them between what you might call like the spiritual world, I don't really like that word, and the physical world. They were totally the same. They were completely interpenetrated. And health, in a very, very large, wide sense, is the manifestation of things being good in the universe, of kind of things being in an optimal state of, and it's not balance at all. That's not the idea. It's not a yin yang balance, but in an optimal state of a word that translates into easiness, which I think the Kurdish women would have really loved. So I'm just going to say two more things in answer to this question. My interest in health and healing continued over the years. I did a study of the growing Jewish healing movement in the US, which was a moment in time that has since kind of fizzled out. I've done research on Americans who don't have health insurance, and I looked at the roles of faith-based organizations in providing medical services in the United States. In case you're interested, I can tell you the answer is they have a lot of visibility, but they do just about nothing. So, in a more profound way, I think that my work with the Kurdish women helped me question taken for granted distinctions, and particularly binary distinctions. So things like right and wrong and good and bad, which I had grown up thinking of, these are opposites of each other. The Kurdish women taught me that it's not that simple. The world is complex. All kinds of things happen. You respond to all kinds of situations in the best way that you can. That's what you can be morally responsible for. But how others judge your responses, or whether those responses are exactly consistent with the written law, that's not the main thing. And I feel still today, so much of my work has to do with questioning taken for granted boundaries. With the Kurdish women on the most simple level, it was the sacred and the profane. I mean, their kitchens were sacred places. They were not, doing really cool kosher things. Their kitchens were sacred places. And, we can talk about that more. But the kitchens also had garbage in them and debris. In my own work today, which is with women who have been incarcerated, women who struggle with histories of sexual abuse and homelessness, I've done a lot of questioning of, like, who gets to decide who's a criminal? And is criminal really a clear category? Today, there's a lot of interest in treatment as opposed to punishment. And I really question, well, what do we mean by treatment? What kind of category is this? Or treatment and punishment dichotomies? So I think that there's a central worldview that I've carried with me into really disparate research projects over the years.
And my last question would be, what are the dilemmas that you grapple with after years of studying the lives of these Kurdish women? And to what extent is this research still present for you? And if so, how do you look at it today?
So how much time do we have?
We have time. We have like 15 minutes. Am I right, Roy? And
Well, for my
five?
portion, probably another
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, so this is really a hard question for me. And when you approached me about this, a few months ago, I started jotting down ideas, and I just have pages and pages of crossed out ideas. And because I think it's changed even over the last few months. There's no simple answer to, what do I still grapple with? So let me just say that one whole area is that I think in my old age, I've become more cynical. And I'm afraid that I downplayed the amount of suffering and the amount of discrimination that these women faced. I think I romanticized them to some extent, even though I came into the study saying, I'm not a folklorist, I'm not studying all these cute rituals. I do think I romanticized them. But here is something that is a dilemma that never stops in my life as an ethnographer, which is I'm a really engaged sociologist, anthropologist, and I understand that in a lot of my work, I give a voice to people who typically are not listened to. And I constantly struggle with, to what extent do I want to reveal the kind of nasty underside of the people that I work with? So I've seen this, with the Kurdish women. There were all kinds of things that I have not included in any of my writing because they were not so nice. Whether it's things about hygiene or things about how some of the women talk to each other. And I still see that in the research I do today with the women who have been criminalized. I've really had to fight with myself not to present them as saints. I think that the women that I've come to know in my own research these days, which is a group of about 50 women that I've followed for the past more than a decade, I think they have really a lot of strengths and wonderful qualities. And I think they also have a lot of really awful qualities. And I'm afraid of writing about the awful qualities because I don't want to take it out of context. So that's something I still grapple with. And I think that ethnographers always grapple with that. I mean, we want to give the full picture. We want to be as accurate as we can. We want to tell the story as we see it. But we realize that what we write is going to have implications for people. So that's something I still grapple with. But I think that in a bigger sense, you asked about how it's still present for me today. I think that I learned from the Kurdish women crucial lessons about suffering, and that thinking about suffering is not just one piece of what religion does, but that understanding suffering, the causes of suffering, interpretations of suffering, responses to suffering, stand at the very center of all important human enterprises. They stand at the heart of any kind of ethical system. They stand at the heart of every moral dilemma. They certainly stand at the heart of every major philosophical or important religious system. So I've never stopped thinking about suffering and responses to suffering in all of my work. So I'm going to close with something that I learned from the Kurdish women that has really shed light on my work with criminalized drug addict women living in the shelters and the gutters of the Boston area 40 years later. So one of the things that I remember so distinctly hearing and witnessing, so it wasn't just said, but it was also done from many of the Kurdish women that I had the honor and pleasure to know all those years ago, was that, and I'm going to actually quote something that I heard more than once, which is, there's always something you can do. That even in the worst situation, there's always something you can do. So if your grandchild has been diagnosed with cancer and you went and you prayed at Rabbi Meir Baal HaNes, and the cancer was not cured. Well, you can go and pray at another tomb, or you can go to some living saint and get a kamea or an amulet, or you can light candles, or you can light a different kind of candles, or you can light the candles in a different place, or you can remember this herbal tea that your grandmother used to make back in Kurdistan that strengthened people's blood, and convince your daughter to give it to her child. So there's an endless repertoire, which also included Western medicine. They had no aversion whatsoever to going to doctors, and they would go to a different doctor if they were not satisfied with what one doctor told them or one doctor did. So there was this sense of there is always something I can do. I'm never at the end of the rope and just give up. There is always something. I can, double check that the chicken I'm making doesn't have any little bits of blood adhering to it. This endless repertoire, which was growing. So they had their repertoire from Kurdistan, but they were very eager to learn things from the Yemenite women they met at the center, from the Ashkenazi women they met in Israel. This openness to the idea that suffering in this world is endless. And if we're really going to care for people, we need to have an infinite number of responses to suffering. Part of that is an idea that suffering is inherent in the world. And if I suffer or my child suffers, it's not because we did something bad. It's not my fault. Suffering is built into the universe. This is such a powerful lesson. I'm still trying to learn it. I don't think I've absorbed it fully. It's become more meaningful to me as a mother and a grandmother. But I just want to contrast this to the women I know in Boston now. And I'll close with this. So almost all the women that I've come to know in Boston, and this is true for almost all women in America who cycle through the criminal justice system, they've been victims of sexual abuse, for the most part, childhood sexual abuse. And the mainstream understanding is that childhood sexual abuse so wounds the individual that, she's going to self-medicate and because drugs are illegal, she'll then be arrested. And that's what's going to bring her into the system. It's this individual trauma. Almost all the women I met at the day center were married off when they were 12 or 13 years old to men that they either never met or didn't want to marry. The marriage was consummated on their wedding night. They did continue to have sex with their husbands. Is that childhood sexual abuse? They did not enjoy it. I heard many women tell me my wedding night was the worst night of my life. Nobody spoke about her wedding with any joyous memories. Aliyah, they spoke about with joyous memories, raising children, not their wedding night. So I have these two populations of vulnerable women who were forced into sexual encounters against their will at a young age. One group ended up traumatized, screwed up for life, addicted to drugs, and in jail. One group ended up making it and raising families, and at the age of 70 or 80, having an understanding of themselves as ritual experts that their family depends on for well-being. What's the difference? How did these two things happen why were the paths so different? And I really come to think that the difference is that the Kurdish women never blamed themselves for what happened on their wedding night. Nobody ever blamed them. Nobody ever told them, you must have been giving the wrong signals, or, why didn't you scream louder? Nobody ever blamed them. This is just what women experience, which has a downside. Do we want to just accept that this is what women experience and not resist it? But in terms of well-being, I think that was crucial. But the other piece was the women in Boston who I've met know of one way of managing suffering, and that's medicine. So it could be illicit medicines that their doctors give them, or it could be illicit drugs they're buying on the street. That is their repertoire of responses to suffering, medicine. In contrast, the Kurdish women had this infinite, open, I think the commiseration is a really good point. Even if they didn't talk about it much, it's knowing that it wasn't me. But this endless growing repertoire of there's always something you can do. So I still hope that I can continue to take that message to heart and implement it in my life as well as in my research. So thank you for great questions, Angie, for listening.
Thank you. Thank you
I-
for these.
Turn
Yeah.
this over to Heftsi to talk about what's happening 40 years later.
Thank you for these great answers. And I'm sure there's going to be a great conversation afterwards during the Q&A. But now let's move on to Heftsi, who is a dear, dear, dear friend. And we've been together in so many projects, and I really could not think of my present life without Heftsi. And before we start with you, Heftsi, I would just like to say that Heftsi and I belong to the Sephardi Mizrahi feminist Bet Midrash Arevot, located in Jerusalem, and that Heftsi was one of the founders of this Bet Midrash. Just for those of you who don't know what Arevot is, since Heftsi is going to refer to it, Arevot has given a home to women who were looking for a place to learn Sephardic rabbinic sources, together with the rituals and oral traditions of the mothers, while grappling with their own dilemmas with feminism. So this is exactly why Arevot was created, so that women would have a space for all this to happen at the same time. And Heftsi, as I said, is one of the founders of this space, and that's how we met. So Heftsi, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. There is so many things going on after Suzanne talking, but I want to start and then see how it goes. So thank you very much for inviting me, Yuval and Angie, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'll say it again, it's an honor to be next to Professor Suzanne Sered, whose work is an inspiration. I would like to share my personal experience, perceptions, and practices of traditional feminism as it is reflected in two spaces in my life: Degel Yehuda, egalitarian Sephardi community, and Arevot, a traditional feminist Bet Midrash, both in Jerusalem. It is important for me to say that I'm bringing my own experience and perspective, but the insight that I will present are a result of a long shared study with my friends at Arevot, like Angie, my community, my family, and teachers along the way. And I want to start with something that happened on Facebook. A few years ago, about a decade after the opening of a very active Orthodox feminist Facebook group, the woman who started the group decided to close it because she had despaired of changes in Judaism. She wrote a very long post explaining why she closed it, and I will quote one sentence that I think sums it all up. Quote, "If you want to be free, equal woman, sovereign over her body, her womb, her sexuality, her health, her love, her joy, then a religious framework is not the place for that." End of quote. This is true. Judaism, like we all know, exerts three well-known mechanisms on women: exclusion, marginalization, and invisibility. But at the same time, because of that post, I felt sorrow. I felt that this abrupt cut off was a double punishment, once given in to the oppressive sides of religion, and once due to self-deprivation from a spiritual connection to tradition, to Torah, and community. But this post also sharpened my self-perception as a feminist traditionalist woman. I live a traditional life. Judaism is an integral part of my identity, my spiritual life, and my creative powers. The Torah, in the broadest sense of the word, thought and deeds, fills me with joy and gives me an anchor in life. I see value in the continuity between the generation, and I insist on holding on to tradition despite tensions and contradictions. Meir Buzaglo discussed the tension between the past and the present, inherent in tradition, but he also suggests that within these tensions lies a solution. He says, tradition is a necessary condition for the possibility for change. Otherwise, there is a series of substitutions one after the other, and not a change and development that requires a nucleus to which one is committed. For me, this is the deep meaning of being feminist and traditionist, to be equally committed to the past and the future. And from that trust in the power of tradition, I challenge it and demand change. I'm privileged, as I said before, to be a member of two really life-changing initiatives, Degel Yehuda and Arevot. And through them, I want to demonstrate some concepts and practices for change and traditional life. So I start with Degel Yehuda. Degel Yehuda is an egalitarian Sephardi community since 2000. I am a member since its inception. It is one of a kind in Israel, though it's inspired many initiatives like that around the world. It's full equality for men and women and all genders. We follow Sephardi Mizrahi halacha and customs. The leadership of the community is non-hierarchical. There is no rabbi. The members of the community are diverse in terms of religious observance and faith on the continuum of what we call secular religious. I want to focus on the dimension of the community. One dimension, the ability to hold tension and contradictions as an infrastructure of the community. Degel Yehuda is basically halachic, apart from the full participation of women. This is in sharp contrast to Ashkenazi partnership communities, which undergo a long process of halachic discussions before making any step towards egalitarianism. And I really witnessed it along the years. So how do we hold this contradiction? In Degel Yehuda, we follow two principles: loyalty with moderation. We are equipped with the way of life of many Sephardi Mizrahi home in which strong connection to tradition existed, but with moderation and a diverse practice of keeping halacha. In fact, we never had any halachic discussion about women's equality. Despite of this breaking of halacha, the public space of the community is halachic in terms of Shabbat, kashrut, without, again, any discussion of rule of conduct. It feels like a shared communal intuition of the balance between breaking halacha and staying loyal to it at the same time. We do not confront halacha, but behave humbly without provocations or confrontations. There is a basic understanding that it will take time for halacha to adjust. And in the meantime, we have to find ourselves a suitable community that can meet our spiritual needs. It's about being flexible, pragmatic, responsive to the changes of time, and most importantly, seeing the person, in this case, a woman, as more than rigid principles, preferring relationship over ideology. I can say that Degel Yehuda has strengthened my observance. I feel more committed and happier with my Judaism. But the problem with women is not only the conflict with the halakha, but also a problem of breaks in the female intergenerational transmission, especially for Mizrahi Sephardi women in Israel. Once by being a woman in a patriarchal world, and once by belonging to the Sephardi Mizrahi culture that was denied. On top of that, there is the loss of the oral tradition that was part of women cult. So Arevot is the space that allows us to build the language and tools to restore the links in the chain of transmission and build a traditional feminist language. I'll say a few more words about Arevot. Arevot, the full name is Arevot Women Woven Tradition. Is a woman Bet Midrash committed to Jewish tradition and feminism. We learn from the Sephardi Mizrahi tradition, both written and oral one, from a female perspective. Our aim is to bring into the Jewish story Sephardi Mizrahi women voices that have not been heard. As in Degel Yehuda, the members of Arevot are of diverse Jewish backgrounds and identities from all walks of life and age. And like Degel Yehuda, Arevot is a non-hierarchical collaborative group. I adapt three concepts that can describe the framework of Arevot: creating women's space, consciousness raising, and Arevut, solidarity. We have created a separate women's safe space for us to share and process our experiences as Sephardi Mizrahi women. This framework enabled the growth of consciousness, discovering our special women's selfhood, both personal and collective. Arevut is the Jewish concept of bonding, of entrusting ourselves to one another. Our responsibility is not only for one another in Arevot, but also for wider circles in general. This is a very important principle that we embrace. Our concern is how to create a caring change, a change based on responsibility. We ask ourselves how the changes we want to apply affect not only the exercise of our rights as women, but the entire system. This caring applies along the axis of time from past through the present to the future, and on the fabric of relationships in family, in the community, in the nation, and in the world. We call it ethics of Arevut. As I already pointed out, female intergenerational transmission is central to our mission at Arevot, but in order to be able to accomplish that, we have to know our female tradition. How do we repair the breaks? Luisa Muraro, the Italian feminist, say that, quote, in traditional culture, the power of the mother has lacked and still lacks a female genealogy. In other words, it has lacked an appropriate way to express and to exercise itself. And she says then, it seems necessary that in order for us women to know the reality of our experience, we must recreate it without obscurity and contradiction. In order to pass on the tradition, it has to be lived and experienced through us in its entirety. We have to reconnect to the tradition of our mother and foremother to all its aspects, the wisdom, the stories, the teaching, as well as the marginalization, the suffering in the Jewish tradition and in the Israeli reality. In a way, the story of Arevot is a story of an effort to restore the chain of transmission, and it is reflected in our project. First, we build a body of knowledge. In the Bet Midrash, we learn from the heritage of the Sephardi Mizrahi sages, both women's issues and from a female perspective. Second, we build women's history that has not been discovered yet through cultural historical research and through rituals and renewal of rituals. The women we investigate are both women who left writings for us and women who weren't educated and not even literate, but their story is also a layer in the sequence of our transmission. The first project that I talk about is Ibat Mizrach, Daughter of the East, groundbreaking Jewish women in Sephardi Mizrahi communities. This is a project designed to bring back into the Jewish story women who left us writings but were excluded from the pages of Jewish history. These women managed to break through the barriers of exclusion from education and learning and became female scholars, leaders, and writers. Women like Osnat Barazani, the head of Yeshiva in Kurdistan from the 17th century, the Hebrew poet Frecha Bat Yosef from Morocco in the 18th century, and from the 20th century, Esther Moyal, a Jewish Arab intellectual and a feminist, Evelyn Kahanov and Bracha Seri. These are only some of the women that are already compiled in a publication that we just had. Despite the great differences between them in terms of historical, geographical, and cultural contexts, They all recognized the importance of tradition and showed flexibility to live between modernity and tradition. These women writers were privileged. They grew up in families who could afford to pay for their education, usually with a supporting father. Haviva Pedaya, in an introduction to the publication of Bat HaMizrach, write about them. Acting in the name of the father means women's ability to integrate into the symbolic order of the canon produced by the father, and teaches men and women alike. However, each and every woman who builds this breakthrough adds a layer and opens a path to the establishment of a culture that comes in the name of the mother and claims in the name of the mother. Alongside the women who left to us written tradition, we also have a project called Shochakot Even, eroding of the stone. Women who accomplished an education against all odds, whose stories are not told. These are transparent women who faced economic difficulties, cultural and social marginalization, and even difficulties such as learning disabilities. They looked for knowledge and tools to take their destiny into their own hand, showing determination and strength. We choose to tell their story not only from the angle of oppressive society, but also through the strength and accomplishment. There is also a place for women who didn't receive any education at all and were unable to overcome the difficulties. These also enter the sequence knowledge and culture, especially in a culture that does not value oral tradition. Another project of Arevot is the renewal of ritual language of our communities. We research and renew traditional rituals, which have almost been forgotten, like if you know Eid al-Banat, El-Awina, and we celebrate these ceremonies together with groups of women, young and old. And in most groups, including religious and older women, they only vaguely remembered these rituals or didn't remember them at all. We also create new rituals as means to link the chain. I want to demonstrate the creation of a new ceremony that Angie and I created together in one of our programs called Vayakhel. So a little background. Parashat Vayakhel in the Torah deals with the Mishkan and include 2 verses about the role of the wise women who participated in the building of the Mishkan. They spin and weave the clothes for the tabernacle. In sources outside the Bible, they also wave the parochet, the veil. It seems like a marginal, relatively small role, definitely not as being a high priestess in pagan religions, and seemingly only using their feminine knowledge of spinning and weaving. But symbolically, their role takes on greater significance. They are responsible for the boundaries of the holy, the cloth that surround the tabernacle on all its sides, separating between the sacred and the profane. And the parochet create another distinction between the holy and the holy of holies. We explored the abundance of sources on the verses from the parasha. Commentaries, Midrash, Zohar, and a wide field of meaning was revealed. We discovered that women are partners in the creation of the world, in the preservation of life, in taking care of the people of Israel in Egypt. In their hand was entrusted the cycle of time. They corrected the sin of the golden calf, and they hold together contrast, justice and mercy, thought and action. When the temple was destroyed and the focus moved from the temple to the Bet Midrash, the women were completely excluded from the world of the Torah, as the Talmud says. Women have no wisdom except in the spindle, precisely the spindle through which they were central to the Mishkan. As traditional women, how do we deal with this exclusion from Torah? We tie ourselves back to the feminine chain using traditional tools. We used a traditional practice and wrote a new Mishe Berach for the women who build the Mishkan. And we pulled the thread up to us the women who are involved in the Torah nowadays. This blessing is said at the end of the Torah reading on Shabbat. Through the blessing, we have created a continuum from our ancient ancestral mothers to the present day. As Luisa Morao suggested, we gave our somehow vague female experience a reality, and thus we restored our relationship with the sequences of our ancestral mothers. We connected our experience of life today with our original experience with the mother. This act of restoration validates our female experience, expands our consciousness as women, and at the same time enriches the Jewish story. We follow a well-known Jewish commandment, which the Sephardi sages emphasize, that every one of the people of Israel must bring out his special share of the Torah that only he or she received at Sinai. And from all the parts of each one, the complete Torah will be built. We women also have a special part, and it is also our duty to bring out our share, not in the margins, but as an essential part of the complete Jewish story. Vayakhel ritual is an example of the practice of change of Arevot, repair without dismantling, not deleting or cutting off, but correcting from within tradition and linking past and present. The last project is maybe the most important project we have in Arevot. This is writing personal essay. A personal essay is a testimony. We decided that instead of writing about traditional feminism, we'll give a direct testimony to our life and write traditional feminism. We write about conflicting identities, about silencing and rediscovering of our female voice, about how to heal national wounds in a Jewish feminine way, about relationship with the mother, and about money. To sum up, each of these projects building historical and cultural knowledge about women, renewal and creation of rituals, and personal testimonies are stepping stones or threads to weave and restoring the chain of transmission to future generations, for women in particular and for the Jewish world, especially in Israel. The old women of your research, Suzanne, are a source of wisdom and are a part of our threads. Angie, do I have more time? More time?
I think you have just a few minutes because we should open the space for discussion.
Okay, so I'll say one more sentence.
Yes.
Some will see tradition and feminism as opposing forces that can't exist together. One turns to the past and the other to the future, but this opposing movement can be seen as creating a rich platform for creativity for the present. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Heftsi. This was great. So should we, maybe we can wait a little bit to see if there's questions coming, and in the meantime, maybe Yuval and I can share some thoughts, maybe some questions with you and Susan. Is that okay? Yeah. Yuval, do you want to start, or?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much, both of you. And I saw a lot of connection. I think it's, but there is also a difference in of course, it's connected to time, but in Susan talk was more on a community that is there, but probably first generation that also experienced their tradition. With Heftsi, it was also the question of returning to a tradition that was already, marginalized or being forgotten or being put aside by second and third generation sometimes. So it's the return perspective, and return that is not only return to something that is stable and fixed, but is return in interpretation, creating a new tradition into it. So if you can talk about these two elements into it. And in both of your talks, there is the echo of the loss. And what is the loss that we're talking about? That was maybe less spoken about.
Who wants to start? Heftsi or Susan?
So I can start. And so interestingly, the women that I knew the best had come to Israel, which was when it was not Israel yet, fairly young. And their parents did not come. So for many of them, they didn't have a full adult understanding of the worldviews and the rituals and practices of their mothers. And it was interesting watching them trying to jog each other's memory and reconstruct what life was like in Kurdistan. And they were very aware that they were in new circumstances. And so even, the word feminism was not relevant. But I can say that everyone that I came to know was really glad that their daughters went to school and were self-supporting and had jobs and weren't dependent on a husband. Their daughters are mostly married, but they really loved that their daughters had some independence. So, in a way, the difference isn't as big as it might seem on the surface. I don't know, Heftsi, what do you think?
It's interesting because you said that they were young when they came here. So they had a relatively small memory or very little memory, but still they had a tradition. Mm-hmm. And when I grew up, it was a total blackout, like mm-hmm. Totally. It's not even forgotten because I didn't know that I forgot. It wasn't there, and I had and the first thing that I needed to do is asking myself, okay, what exactly am I missing? But because I lived in the hegemony, it always reflected my lacking of something very crucial that I didn't know how to label. So this reclaiming back and this process is really therapeutic for me and for us in our vote, because it's of course we do it in a different, very different consciousness, because we are very aware of our action. It's a political action. It's not. We are not just living our life, but yeah, but it's a huge. It's interesting that you say that, because I imagine them very wise, very knowledgeable, and they just came with something that was there all the time, so they could do it and could work with it. And me and my generation weren't like that. It was complete silent.
I was thinking,
if I can just say something that, to add to what Heftsi said, I think the difference is if they came before 48 or after 48, before the creation of the state or not. Because if they came before, there's the state apparatus that, with the education, with the schooling, with everything that forced this kind of, distance yourself from your tradition. And it's a story in that sense.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think that's true, but I absolutely agree. And I think that, being non-literate is so central. And on the one hand, being non-literate doesn't give you access to sources of status and power and a million other things. But on the other hand, being non-literate allows you to call whatever you want to call Katuv B'Torah. And I'm guessing that some of the women had some understanding that this wasn't literally Katuv B'Torah, and they certainly had an understanding that the challenges and resources in their lives were quite different from what their mothers experienced. They remembered Kurdistan, but they really came of age here. So it's interesting, The world changes, as I said. The world turns. It, doesn't stay the same.
Yeah.
I think this what Yuval was referring to about the return is critically important here as a connector in between both parts, but also in general for the kinds of things that we've been discussing in this series. The idea that the past, that we can't avoid but having a relationship with the past. When you don't have a relationship with the past, that is also a relationship, and it doesn't turn out well. Like if your relationship with the past is based on oblivion, forgetting, just distancing, acting as if it didn't exist, that can't end up well. So there is in a way our relationship with our past is inevitably connected with our future aspirations, and this is a theme that keeps appearing in this seminar. The idea that behind every research project, there's also a vision for a better world. That in general we want to contribute something to the world with the work that we do. In general, people want to do good things, and in general, people want to think about the past in order to be able to gather ideas and about a future. And in this sense, Susan, I was thinking about what you were saying about the, romanticizing or not romanticizing. I, as an ethnographer, I've also grappled with these things, and one of the things that I often think about is to what extent are my worst qualities more telling about who I am than my best qualities, and to what extent would it be a fair depiction of me to speak about the worst qualities that I have in a, say, 20-page piece. And the reason why I think about this is because I have, throughout the years, I've met wonderful, wonderful people that I've interviewed that have influenced me tremendously. And I know that they can also be very difficult people. However, when thinking about what to present and what not, I always ask myself this question: to what extent are these less wonderful things representative of this person? And to what extent are these things going to help the reader grasp who this person is? And the reason why I think it's important in the context of our discussions here in the seminar is because it is very common to hear, I mean, at least I've been accused of that many times, of like idealizing, in my case, Morocco, and like painting an ideal. I don't know why anyone would think that, but I always wonder, is there a way in which we can say something not bad about Morocco, or something good about Morocco that wouldn't constitute an idealization in the eyes of so many that are convinced that there is nothing of value in this country? So I think that's why I connected it, because I think that in many ways, when we present like negative aspects of someone or of a place, in a way that comes, or that fits in with the prejudice that was already there, and creates and reinforces this negative image about a country, a collective, or whatever.
So yeah. Oh, go ahead, finish.
No, yeah, that's it.
So I'd like to respond to that. I don't think there's an easy answer, but for me personally, because I've spent so much of my career working with communities of people who are at the bottom of social hierarchies and who have negative reputations in the broader world. I mean, even, now we say, oh, the Kurdish women, so, cute and sweet. I mean, Kurds were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, below Moroccans, below Tunisians. You know, a lot of Kurds would say, you know, my family's from Iraq. They won't want to say Kurdistan. So I think that when you work with populations that are particularly vulnerable to discrimination, and discrimination isn't just symbolic, it's real.
No.
It's
Yeah.
access to resources. If I'm going to err, I'm very happy to poke fun at myself and to reveal my own weaknesses. I think that any writing project that we do, we're always picking and choosing. We can't write down
100%.
every single solitary thing that anyone ever said to us and everything we ever saw and every smell and every sound and every taste. So we choose, and yeah, we want to make the world better. So
Yeah.
we, for me, this conflict is even more dramatic with my current research with women who have been criminalized, because a lot of them do really crappy things. You know, stealing, cheating, ratting on each other. And I also have to balance in both cases with the Kurdish women and in my current research, but it's even harder in my current research, is I don't want to present people as victims. But in our very binary world, especially when you're dealing with, criminal elements, people are perpetrators or victims. And I want to reject that. And so I do want to acknowledge that the Kurdish women that I was fortunate enough to get to know, yeah, they struggled with poverty. They had low social status, all these things. And yes, they were victimized in many ways, but like being a victim wasn't the essence of who they were. It's there's no easy answer. And I acknowledge that, yes, in any project we pick and choose. When I tell my own story, I pick and choose. I can't tell every single thing that ever happened to me in my entire life. I try to tell a narrative that I see has some meaning and makes sense. So no easy answer.
Thank you. And Heftsi, so with regards to the question of return in what you presented, I think that there's a couple things that also connect with what Sigal and Neta said in the last session about responsibility or the taking into account the impact on the entire system. How they both insisted that Mizrahi feminism necessarily, they didn't want a piece of the cake, wanted a different cake, and that's the expression that Sigal used. And taking into and thinking about this way, how you presented a tradition. I'm thinking about how you presented tradition and how they presented Mizrahi feminism in terms of taking into account how what we do has an impact on the entire system, and also putting the focus on first ethics of arevut, ethics of mutual responsibility, and the ability to withhold contradiction, that is to hold contradiction, that is so important in times of conflict, when there are many things that we are not going to be able to agree on, that we can't base our peaceful relation on agreement. We're just going to have to agree to, as Neta Marshif said, to save each other. We're going to have to agree to put aside so many things in order to enable life. And I thought this resonated with what you were saying, with being humble while making space for your own story as well.
It's very difficult because sometimes the ability to live with contradictions, with conflict, and say, I want to hold it. I don't want to revolutionize everything, is sometimes very, very hard, because you have to walk slow, you have to stop. You are always juggling between options. And it's very tiring, because a clear-cut worldview that you want or a vision of the world that you are walking to is maybe much easier to handle. Mentally, I don't know how to say, but but I've because I'm very deeply connected to tradition, and it gives me joy. It's really a source of my creativity. I don't want to lose it. So I try to not to give up. I think Degel Yehuda is a great example of how to be very radical in changing halacha, and at the same time hold other things together with it. It's really amazing that we never had a discussion about halacha, and still we could move with it, together with it, and it's a real home. So it is working. It can work if you say, okay, this area I won't touch for the moment, and I live my life, and I create something in the world that will make an impact and will move the rabbis or the halakha or whatever in another direction. So,
thank you, Heftsi. Roy, are there questions?
We haven't had some questions. We do have a comment from Dina Brouwer, who mentioned that there was also a loss of tradition for young women who were well educated and did not make Aliyah. She mentioned her mother from Morocco who moved to France and lost much of her mimetic traditions. I haven't had questions besides that. But I can echo that and just mention that there are in the 20th century, there's also the context of migration where there's many Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews have to find themselves and have to and lose traditions through those migrations. And it happens in Morocco as well, with Orthodox rabbis who come to Morocco in the 20th century and start changing the character of important communities there, and we see that effect up until today. It's these very long roots for these processes.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody that if anybody wants to open their microphone and make a comment or ask a question, you are very welcome to do so. And Ayemima.
Thank you so much for two beautiful presentations, and you gave me a lot of things to think about. Both of you, thank you so much. I'm struggling a little bit, and I'm not sure if it's a comment or a question, or just to maybe you take it where you think you can. You both you spoke about suffering, and in some kind of tradition of suffering, which belongs to the female or experience in those respective communities, or living under oppression, and nonetheless having a kind of dignified life, a life that has some kind of fulfillment, also self-fulfillment, even though the steps of those respective women in those respective communities were shrinked, and nonetheless with the very reduced realm that they could act, it sounds like there is so much to say about that. So strategies that these women developed in order to live dignified life under oppression and suffering. And I would love to hear more about that if you can. So whether it has to do with the Jewish law and the halakha and how to practice it in a dignified, how to own it again as a woman, if it's in the kitchen or outside the kitchen, in raising children, or creating a kind of Torah Shebel Peh for women from their own being excluded from the Torah Shebechtav, from the written Torah, and creating their own kind of a Torah, or a Torah of the mother, so to say. I would love to hear if you have some more insights about that, about specific strategies that these women allows them to endure, to exist, and to increase their and enrich their life under those circumstances.
Thank you, Yemima. I just want to remind us all that we have 6 minutes.
Okay, I'll just say that in my point of view, the Vayakhel ceremony that we developed was exactly like that, like taking 2 verses, like small verses, and just by reading something, we discovered a whole world that we didn't see it before. So it was, for me, it was very powerful to find it. So it's not saying, wow, look at Judaism, what a great religion it is, it's so kind to women. No, the opposite. To say, look, why women should be an equal part, and like an equal part of the story, and an equal in terms of status, in terms of equality, in terms of everything, like bringing it more to the foreground, and like Chaviva Pedaya said, to start speaking in the name of the mother through these different way of looking at the same thing that we grew up with. So I hope it's.
Yeah, so I would echo what Heftsi said, and the whole project that she talked about really relates to your comment. I guess one of the things that I, always like to remind myself when I, look back at either this research or any of the research projects that I've done or I'm still doing, I talk so much about women's cooking. And, in my earlier writings about the Kurdish women, I included recipes, very detailed recipes. I think that's really, really important. I think that there's a lot of creativity and wisdom that is embedded into food preparation. But I think it's critical never to lose sight of the fact that how much food there is and whether there's any food at all is determined by macro forces over which these women and most women have zero power. So at the same time that we can appreciate how creative they are with rice and a handful of beans, we have to understand that this isn't necessarily their choice. There's other global forces, national forces, and their husbands that determine how much chicken is coming into the house as opposed to just scraping by with a bit of rice. I think that's really, really, really important. But what I've seized on, Yemima, in your comment is the word dignity. And I think that's kind of the word that I was looking for. And I see that as a difference between the Kurdish women that I worked with and the women I'm working with now. And I think that the dignity comes from, what philosophers talk about is, people's quest for meaning. And having meaning in our life and feeling that what we do makes a difference, there's no dignity without that. And I think that a lot of the women that Heftzi's cohort is modeling themselves on and drawing on are women who figured out how to develop dignity and hold on to dignity even in a shitty world. But we certainly don't want to romanticize or replicate the shitty world. What we want to do is, lift up and hold on to the dignity part. So I'm just going to close by saying that, Heftsi, I love the concept of arivut. I like that better than the ethics of care. Because of the mutuality of it, for many reasons. But I think that that's wonderful, and I just want to thank you for introducing me to that language.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Heftsi. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Menchi. Thank you, Yuval. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us and for your continued support of this series. And we just want to remind you before we leave that our last meeting will be on May 7th with the one and only Netel Kayam. She's going to be having a dialogue with Yuval and me called Arenas, Music Remembers What History Forgets. We hope to see you all then. And thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.